Sounds good.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Barb Tyson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Salty Dog webinar. With us today, we have Zach Smith from Fiorentino, who will be presenting ParaAnchors and Sea Drogues. Before we get started, please remember to keep muted, keep your video off. That really does help the people who have limited bandwidth. I have opened a chat box. If you don't see it, maybe hover over either the bottom or the top of your screen until you see chat, and that should open that box up for you. And that's where you can go ahead and type in any questions that you have for Zach. Go ahead and type them in as you think of them, and we'll get to those questions then. And we are going to record this webinar. I'm going to send out a link to everyone who's registered. You'll be able to review today's presentation, or of course, for those who weren't able to join us live. So Zach, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Barb. Well, my goal today is to provide you with different deployment options to make it a little bit easier to deploy parachute sea anchors or storm drogues. And probably the one thing I want you to remember the most is that slack rode is actually not a good thing, because if you have too long a period of slack rode, what'll happen is it disengages the drag device, and eventually your boat will fall sideways to the ways where you can have knockdowns and so forth. The good news is the solutions are actually rather simple. If you have any questions anytime during this presentation, stick to the subject matter at hand, because eventually I'll get to bridles and recovery and things like that. So go ahead and I have no problem answering questions any time. I was looking at how long I've been working with Fiorentino the other day, and I've been working with them since 1995. In 97, which this picture is of one of my first boat shows I started attending. I just want to kind of give credit to Gerard Fiorentino. It's kind of nice when you have a mentor that has a lot of experience to kind of give you the ins and outs and how to use this type of equipment. And he really did it right. I just didn't know all the type of formulas that make everything work, like how to eliminate slack rope and so forth. The neat thing is, having that initial foundation, I went out and did a lot of trial and error with various types of boats, and I started seeing patterns of what was working and what wasn't working. And I've worked with a lot of different organizations like NASA, Coast Guard, Navy, etc. And I noticed the same patterns with these type of vessels, like with a NASA space capsule, for example. It's a very tipsy item that's floating on the water. So we actually ended up using ropes and so forth that had no stretch in them to make them work a little bit better. Now with the Coast Guard, this actually was something we shipped to a Sentinel class cutter recently. And if you look at the top of the picture, you can barely make out our SO operator, who's actually a rather good sized person. And you can see we make anything from small to large type of devices. With the Navy, when I've been working with them, a lot of times they want parachutes that kind of eject like dragsters. You see the chutes coming out the back, or stopping boats immediately. In some cases, they want parachute anchors for the purpose of slowing drift down in case they have mechanical failures. Ocean Cleanup is an organization that cleans up plastics that are floating around in the oceans. Projects like this were rather difficult to handle, just simply because we had to add all kinds of floats and weights to make sure that the chute wouldn't sink too much or float to the surface too much. So all these things, like I said, all have similar patterns of behavior, of whether you're getting too much slack or too much loading, or things will break. A lot of times we make mistakes and stuff will break. So like I was mentioning earlier, the thing that we want to avoid the most is slack rope, because if you have too much slack rope in the system, what eventually ends up happening is you create a lot of shock loadings. At some point, that drag device is going to reinflate and cause so much shock loading that it could potentially break rope. This was a customer of ours that was holding to a parachute sea anchor, and he didn't heave to with a bridle. He didn't have any weights added to the rope or anything like that, and it took a number of about 6 hours before that rope broke. And also, if that rod had been 1-inch rope from experimentation that we've done on the open ocean, it's only a matter of 5 hours difference between a 5/8-inch rod or a 1-inch rod before it breaks, assuming you have a lot of shock loading occurring in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the differences between a parachute sea anchor and a storm drogue. Parachute sea anchors are very large devices that are deployed off the bow of the boat. The idea is to slow the boat down enough and to pull the bow into the seas that it will help stabilize the boat. A lot of bows are designed to handle a lot of rough seas. And the side benefit just happens to be we're going to have drift rate reduction of about a half a knot to a nautical mile every hour. Most people that I've talked to over the years that have actually deployed the parachute sea anchors, it's typically because most of the crew was seasick or exhaustion. Those are the number one reasons why people actually will deploy the parachute sea anchor. In some cases, you might be heading into the weather. You're not making any ground. You know, you've been sailing for a day. You've only made a 1 nautical mile difference in your travel. So why not just deploy the parachute and let the weather pass you by? Because in about a day or two, it'll probably calm down enough for you to actually actively sail further distances. So those are some of the primary reasons that people will actually use the parachute sea anchor. It's pretty rare that you're using it because it's a life or death situation, but there are cases of that occurring. Speed limiting drogues, storm drogues, are basically anything that you tow behind your boat. So in this case, speed limiting drogues are going to be very small devices that actually only slow your boat down a little bit. So it trims about, I'd say, about a third of the speed that you're traveling when you're running in heavy weather. Now, the wind and waves are all behind you. You're running so darn fast that what will start to happen is you'll start losing control of the boat. And you'll have sort of this zigzag pattern where you'll hit the bottom of the trough kind of sideways a little bit. It's called broaching. And so sometimes you can spin out that way. So that's really a primary reason why people are using speed limiting drogues. We just want to slow down a little bit, but we're going to actively steer. With the parachute anchor or the speed limiting drogue, lee shore does, factor into it. Obviously, if you're running with the drogue, you don't want to be running directly towards shore, or likewise, if you have a parachute anchor deployed, you don't want to drift backwards and end up on shore. So you do have to have a little bit of sea room for a lot of this type of equipment. There is another storm drogue referred to as a stopping drogue or a series drogue, also called a Jordan series drogue. This is more of a passive tactic like the parachute sea anchor. You're going to deploy it and you're going to go down below and wait for the storm to pass. The difference with the series drogue versus the parachute sea anchor is the parachute anchor is going to make sure that your bow is going to be faced into the weather. In the case of the series drogue, it's going to be the stern facing the weather itself. So which is better? I get a lot of people asking me questions. Okay, which one would you choose? Well, I really think it's personal preference. If you kind of lean towards, I never want to stop my boat, which is possible. You can be in the Southern Ocean having waves coming from different directions. Even myself, I probably don't really want to stop in that case. I want to keep moving the boat so I can get out of that kind of condition. Other people say, well, I'm worried about mechanical breakdowns, not really worried about storms. Well, then the likelihood of you wanting the parachute sea anchor might be a better choice for you. They all work really well. It's just a matter, again, of personal preference. I want to go over road a little bit more before I go into the deployment procedures of all this different equipment. Nylon, Dacron, those two types of fibers are the most commonly used ropes. Of course, now we've all heard of Dyneema and Spectre, which are very strong, lightweight ropes. But one of the reasons I kind of like the nylon Dacron roads is because they are heavier, and you can see here on the chart what every 100 feet of rope what the weight is there. The heavier and bigger the rope, the more it creates drag. So just like the drag device in the water, road will also create drag. Now, the disadvantage, of course, of the road is it's heavy. You have to move that heavy road around. And normally, if you're carrying 10 feet of road for every foot of boat, whether it's for parachute sea anchor use or storm drogue use, that's a lot of rope to be moving around. Now, the Spectra and Dyneema, it's half the weight of the nylon and Dacron road, and it doesn't absorb water. Now, nylon and Dacron will absorb water, which increases the weight and increases the drag, but it also reduces the strength of your nylon and Dacron roads. About 30 to 40% of your road strength is lost once it absorbs water. And if you add any kind of shock loading into the system, meaning that rope again goes slack for a very long period of time, the drag device reinflates and then creates that jerking motion. That's another loss of about 40% of your road, which is why we've all heard of stories of roads and stuff like that breaking. It's just because there was shock loading and you lose the strength of rope when it gets wet. Now, the disadvantage of the Spectra and Dyneema rope is that it floats and it has a tendency to bunch up when I'm deploying. So if I'm dropping a parachute or a storm drogue into the water, it starts to bunch up until that parachute fully inflates, and then it will eventually pull all the road straight. If you want to avoid bunching up, you have to add weight to Spectra and Dyneema. That's just the negative of it. The nylon and Dacron, you don't necessarily have to add weight to the road to make it perform any better. So on average, I use 20 pounds of weight. If I have a large parachute sea anchor, I'll probably add about 10 pounds of weight. But if it's a storm drogue, the ones that we're towing behind the boat, I'm always adding 20 pounds of weight to the Spectra road. Now, what you can do, we just shipped this out to the Coast Guard about 2 months ago, and we divided the 7/8" road that we were supplying for them into two 300-foot lengths. So you can divide these roads into different lengths if you're going to use nylon or Dacron. It's just easier to handle. And most of the time for storm use, you only need about 300 feet of road anyhow. So that's what you can even divide it into 400-foot length to whatever length you want. I had another customer I was speaking with that said, well, you know what, I only need 5/8" rope for my entire system, but I'm going to have 250 feet of 5/8" road for gale force conditions. And then I'm going to have that connected to 3/4" road. So if I really get caught in a storm, I have extra chafe protection with a thicker road. Guess what? No problem. That's another way of doing it. There's no really wrong way of doing things, setups like that. I do use shackles though instead of swivels. You can see in the picture there's a bow shackle there. They're just much stronger than swivels. You have a bolt that's usually causing the swivel to spin. It's a bolt and nut basically welded together. That's kind of a weak link on swivels. So, and they don't always spin under load anyhow. So if you're connecting roads, I just go with shackles. Now, bridle setups come in two forms. They're either going to be a pendant line, which is a line with a short line with a snatch block at the end of it, which you see. I don't know if it's your left or my left, but on my left, it's the block in the darker picture. A fixed bridle are two roads that typically are shackled into the primary road leading out to the drag device. The diameter of the road will be the same as the road leading out to the drag device. I have lengths of one, and every manufacturer is going to be different, so it's always good to ask a lot of questions. My bridle lengths, whether it's a pendant line or a fixed bridle, is 1 foot for every foot of boat. Whether it's a parachute anchor deployment or a storm drogue deployment, I like short bridles because it keeps more loading in the system, keeps more tension in the system. I don't end up with stuff going slack. Another good idea, if you do have a bridle, this is a picture of a fixed bridle. I use any kind of, it could be cheap duffel bags like in the picture here. I will keep the roads separated. It's easier to find when it's nighttime, and if you have both roads together, you always have to kind of take the time to pull them apart for setting up the bridle on your boat. Just easy to find. If it's a pendant line, same thing. I'll have it separated from the anchor road. Just always easier to. What was that?
My phone.
Oh, okay. I heard voice from someone. No problem. Okay. So the basic setup that you need for a parachute sea anchor will be the parachute anchor itself. It usually includes the hardware, nylon rod, and then a trip line. The nylon rod, of course, is the rope that's attached to the hardware of the parachute. The trip line is what we use for recovering the parachute later on when we're done using it. Trip lines are normally 50 to 100 feet in length, and they're floating rope, polypropylene. The nylon rod again, or the Dacron rod, or the Spectra, we carry 10 feet for every foot of boat for worst case storm scenarios. Now, if I'm going to do long distance traveling, I typically at least have the road ready to go. I don't have to have the parachute sitting on deck unless the storm is approaching. I think, well, you know what, the weather might turn on me. Maybe I better have the parachute anchor ready to go. Now, in the picture, I have the road passed over the lifeline because I've been on a few boats where I'm trying to deploy the equipment and the darn fender that's attached to the trip line won't fit between the lifelines. Now, if that's not an issue, you can deploy your rope and everything under the lifelines. Just be aware of the stanchion. That's right here, so that no ropes get accidentally wrapped around anything. You can also, if you don't feel comfortable crawling on the deck when the weather is getting a bit rough to deploy parachute anchors, you can deploy from the cockpit. In this picture, again, you'll see the rope passed over the lifeline. I have about 150 feet of road in the cockpit area because that's what I'm comfortable with deploying over the lifelines. The thing about deploying from the cockpit, if I want to go underneath the lifelines with my road instead, make sure you cleat it off really taut so that rope doesn't end up dragging in the water, because none of us like having lines dragging in the water because they can wrap around things. There's a lot of people in the past that have talked about using plastic ties or cotton ties around the tow rail to keep the line on the outside. The problem is every time I've deployed a parachute sea anchor, the ties wouldn't break or the string wouldn't come loose. And now I have to crawl on deck anyway to cut all the string or plastic ties off. And even if it does break easily, what's going to happen while you're sailing, they tend to start breaking. And now you have your rod dragging in the water. So when it comes time for deploying, hopefully you have engine power. I prefer to use engine power when I'm deploying the equipment. You're going to quarter the waves so that none of us go straight into the waves because of the pounding motion we receive. We try to take it at an angle, but if for some reason your engine isn't working, you will have, of course, minimal sail up. I will usually backwind the jib if it's a vessel that has a staysail set up, then go ahead and backwind the staysail. And that buys you a short period of time, a very short period of time in which you can deploy your equipment on the windward side of the boat. We always deploy our parachute anchors on the windward side, and we retrieve everything on the windward side, just because if we get knocked around by wind and wave, we want to be knocked away from all of this stuff. We don't want to accidentally run over the equipment. Now, the first thing that we're going to deploy will be the trip line. They have the big fender at the end of the trip line. I toss the trip line in the water. Normally the boat's moving very quickly away from the trip line so I can go to the next step. But if I notice that my trip line is just sitting next to the boat, and this can happen sometimes if the waves are large enough. I'm in a situation where the waves were big enough that it was blocking so much of the wind, we weren't moving away fast enough from the trip line. So on a rare occasion that can happen. So you'll just have to increase vessel drift some way, whether putting up some sail or motoring in reverse, basically. So as I get the trip line out, I'm going to grab the parachute sea anchor, and it doesn't matter what brand it is. A lot of parachute anchors come in deployment bags where you're supposed to toss those bags in the water, or in this case, we don't use deployment bags. We just drop everything in the water. You have to maintain control of that hardware. You'll see my sailing partner has his hand on top of the stainless. That's so it doesn't drop and make a mess. So if you accidentally do by chance drop the parachute somewhere, no problem. You have control of the hardware. You can then pick up the parachute and drop that in the water, followed by the stainless hardware. So always keep control of the hardware. That's a big part of it. You can see even in this picture where you can see a hand on the right-hand side holding onto that hardware, making sure that the parachute and hardware fall into the water equally. Now, if you're doing a cockpit deployment, if you have any rods that are sitting on top of the lifelines, you want to grab that rod right away and get that over the stanchion of lifelines, just so it doesn't catch accidentally when you're deploying the equipment. As your boat's drifting away from everything, you will see air pockets in the parachute anchors. It's not a big deal. The hardware is already sunk, and eventually the canopy will start capturing the water, and you'll see it inflate rather quickly. If the parachute anchor is wrapped up in the bag, it has a tendency to float a whole lot, and some of the brands overseas, unfortunately, the bag flips up and creates an air pocket. So the parachute bag and everything acts like a fender. To alleviate this problem, if you have something like that, just add maybe 10 pounds of chain. That's roughly, 8 feet of 3/8 inch chain, roughly, approximately. And that will sink everything really quick. The trick is get everything underwater as quickly as possible, because if you're in rough seas, you already have breaking seas around you. Well, it's not difficult to unintentionally tangle something. And as I mentioned,
Zach?
yes.
Zach, we do have a couple questions here.
Yes.
One, I think, was two photos back. The pictures of the stern, but you deploy the ParaAnchor to the bow. She says she's confused.
Oh, I'm sorry. Parachute sea anchors, in most cases, are always going to be deployed from the bow, just like your regular ground tackle, your metal anchor, because we're trying to keep the bow into the weather. So parachute sea anchors are deployed from the bow. Oh, now I get what she's.
But you get this one. You have deployed from the stern here.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, what's going on is some people prefer to deploy parachute sea anchors from the stern. Okay. And see if I can go back a couple of pictures real quick here. Where was the other picture? You can see in this picture, I had the rod passed over the lifelines, right? So as I'm deploying the parachute anchor over the water, the parachute trip line, everything else is in the water. The 150 feet of rod is in the water, but that rod up here is still sitting here. And so that picture you see is my partner quickly grabbing that rod to make sure it doesn't catch on the stanchion for cockpit deployments. That's only for cockpit stern deployments, but the rod is still attached to the front of the boat, to the bow. on a cleat, Samson post, whatever, up forward. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Sometimes I move quickly on this stuff.
I had another question too earlier on for the drogue. When you were talking about bridles, do you always use a bridle for a drogue? I mean, I guess that makes sense, but I just wanted to confirm.
Yes, usually, and I will get to the drogue section and you'll see the bridle setups on that. So it'll be pretty simple once I get to that point. Thank you. Okay, here's the slack road that I was talking about earlier, the thing that I want to avoid the most. And it's the same thing I seen. What's been happening is for years, a lot of the suppliers just kept, which I understand, they wanted to pay out lots of road to reduce shock loading from the loading from the big parachute, but actually it created more slack in the system because nylon stretches a whole lot. And so there are a couple of different things we can do to actually alleviate that issue. So if I'm going to deploy parachute, I don't like messing with chain to reduce slack rope. So I will adjust the road. So if it's calm weather, I may be waiting to get into San Francisco Harbor, because sometimes at night when you got that ebb tide flowing, it's difficult to actually make it through there. I might want to spend the night offshore. It's not really rough out. I'm going to have about a boat length or two of that road paid out to the chute, because now it's more like it's turning into a cable because it doesn't have very much stretch because I have a very short length deployed. Gale force conditions I commonly deploy about 150 feet, and storm force about 250 to 300 feet is what I deploy. Normally, that's why I like to part my roads into 200-300 foot lengths if that's how much road I'm going to carry. Because I know most of the time from experience that 300 feet is all I really need to keep tension in the system. And every company is going to be different again. There's going to be some that say, no, you need 15 feet of rope for every foot of boat. Others are going to base it on the wave height times 20, which could be 2,000 feet of rope. So always really good to ask lots of questions when you're contacting different manufacturers to get pricing and their ideas on how to rig equipment. The second option, if you don't want to adjust rope, because in reality, if you do have to make some rope adjustments during a storm, you have to go on deck. You're going to have to create slack in that road that's very taut. And so that might be something you don't want to do. So if you just want to always deploy one length of rope, whether it's 300 feet or 600 feet, you can always add about 10 pounds of chain to the chute. So when there is slack in the rope, and there will be slack in the road, it will sink and keep the parachute inflated. Because I am just trying to reduce the lag time of the chute collapsing and then reinflating. That's what really generates a lot of that shock loading I've been talking about. And you have deployment bags, I have a tendency to add a little bit more weight, just if you happen to have a parachute anchor with that. Many suppliers don't recommend adding chain next to the chute. They're talking about adding chain mid-scope to relieve the slack rope issue, but that's the same thing you would use on a ground tackle. It doesn't work with a parachute because everything's fluid, everything's moving. When you have ground tackle, you're actually staying in one location. There's a slight variation there when we're deploying this kind of equipment. Now, let's say we do everything correct. We have the parachute anchor deployed. On the monohull sailboats especially, they have a tendency to tack back and forth. So even though I don't have a lot of slack in the system, it's still going to tack back and forth from the port to starboard. So we have a couple options. We can heave to with a bridle. That means we're going to be about 40-45 degrees off the wind. Or we can fly a riding sail off the back of the boat, and I fly these like a kite so that it captures enough wind to kind of sail backwards. That will allow us to stay in that position. So does motoring slightly in reverse. If all else fails, you can motor in reverse slightly, and that will allow you to maintain a head-to-wind station. Now, pendant lines are only it's a short road with a snatch block. That's what a pendant line is. The moment the pendant line is connected to your road that leads out to the parachute sinker, you're now forming a bridle. And all the snatch blocks, whether they're plastic or rubber, metal in this shown in the picture, they all have some kind of opening plate. So I like to deploy all the parachute equipment first, then I add the pendant line. And I have the pendant line length of 1 foot to every foot of boat, simply because I have to walk backwards in the cockpit to be able to attach that road to a primary winch. By the time I'm done using it, I'll be using half that amount of rope, more than likely. But the trick in setting the pendant line is to wait for your boat to swing to windward. So you want the stern to swing to windward towards the parachute before you start cranking in on that winch, because it gives you the perfect angle to pull the anchor rod back towards the boat, and the bridle setup will end up near the shroud lines. It'll be very close to, you can almost touch the block. That's how close it will end up at your boat. But if you happen to start cranking in on that primary winch when you're head to wind, what's going to happen is the block rolls right up the road and smacks the side of your boat. And then you're going to think, oh, well, this doesn't work. Well, yes, it works. You just have to wait for the boat to swing to windward before you pull on that. It's all about angle of pull. Now, one thing, I brought this picture. This is a new picture I've added to my presentation. I was trying to do a photo shoot where we could show heaving to with a parachute anchor, and this is a Beneteau, and they swing all over the place. They don't heave to very well. And so I actually ended up anchoring the bridle amidship really close up forward. It actually started working even in 5-knot winds. Now that we had really light winds, I put out my main a little bit so it would capture some of the wind, but it actually worked. And this is also the same position I use on motor sailors, since they have kind of their sailboat, but they have some characteristics of a powerboat. A lot of times I'll do midship stuff like that. So something to consider if you're having problems heaving to with your boat while you're holding to a parachute, that's just another option. In this picture, I just want to show you that you can do makeshift type line. To say you didn't have a pendant line, you just had the parachute system. You can just get a rode. It could even be a dock line with a bowline that you attach to a shackle, but shackles will actually slide down that road. And again, you wait for the stern to swing to windward, you start cranking in that road. It'll actually allow you to heave to that way. And it'll still work even if you don't have a stopper. That's a stopper line that we're showing. Stopper lines this keeps the shackle from sliding around too much. But if you're caught up in a storm, you may not have the time to mess around with trying to do rope adjustments. You just need to slide something down the road. And by the way, since I'm talking about sliding things down the road, you can also do that in a pinch too with a parachute anchor. You can always have a shackle with a small mud anchor and connect that to the road on the front of your boat, and just if you're head to wind, you can just slide that all the way down, and eventually it'll make its way down towards the chute. That's another way in an emergency situation to go ahead and try to reduce that slack road. Things happen all the time. Now, if you want to go to a head to wind position, some boats just behave better that way. They just perform well with head to wind. You'll either have to have a strong fair lead to have the road running out, or you'll have to use some kind of a cleat setup. This is my boat again. I left the anchor on there just to show you that that's actually a chafe point. I know if most of you are doing long distance, you're probably putting your anchor tackle away, but that is a chafe point if you didn't put it away. So any type of roads for a head to wind position, that's where you run it through. I don't typically run anchor roads through anchor rollers, only because it tends to bend the bracket. Unless you have a really strong anchor bracket, you can actually bend that stuff, surprisingly. I've done it a few times. Another option for staying in a head to wind position would be to fly a riding sail, but you have to fly it like a kite. So as you can see, there's a halyard on the top portion of this triangular sail, and the other two rods are either tied up on the push boot or quarter cleats. And the trick is making sure that riding sail's above the dodger, because that will block some of the wind. One thing I do like about this approach, but it requires work to put this together, especially on a bouncing boat. Things can be a challenge. That you can raise it higher if you get into bigger seas. As you get in bigger waves, you ever had a boat fall into waves before? You'll start to notice that the wind kind of dies momentarily until you ride back up on top of the wave. So that's another option for setting up. Many authors and several manufacturers have recommended chain at the boat end for protection of chafe, which is fine. I just don't believe in using the chain at the boat end to alleviate the slack road, because I don't think it does hardly anything unless you follow some of the instructions that say we'll pay out 150 feet of chain. Well, to me, that's just going to be very cumbersome and difficult to recover. So just pay out a few inches of chain if you're going to use a rollers, a few inches of chain, and put chafe gear around that, because that chain will eat up your bracket if you don't have some kind of chafe protection on that particular setup. I don't usually use chain at the boat end. It's difficult for setting up bridles. You'd have to use a shackle kind of. And I'm showing you pictures in calm weather, so you can imagine just in mild, sloppy weather how much this becomes a challenge to put all this type of equipment together. So I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. If you think the weather's going to be rough, I would go ahead and have roads ready to go, or at least have your bridle ready to go on with the equipment. I'm going to go faster now through some of this stuff because I'm repeating what I already said instruction wise on how to deploy from a monohull sailboat. If you happen to eventually become a trawler owner, yes, it works just as well on trawlers as sailboats. So what you always do is remember, we're recording the weather, we're going to deploy the fenders and trip line into the water first. And you can see that Fiorentino here was maintaining control of the hardware with his hand sitting on top of the stainless. So he's going to go ahead and deploy it that way. And what I've seen from the trawlers, and this is really kind of nice, is every time I've deployed rode on most of these boats, I only have to deploy through one chock or tie off on a cleat. And the boat kind of sets 10 degrees off the wind, kind of like a natural hove to position. And I don't have to mess with any bridles. And a lot has to do with the cabin. And you'll notice even on the sailboats, if you have a really tall, high cabin, doghouse, things like that, that all affects the leeward drift wind-wise. So sometimes the cabins actually are benefit, on the trawlers especially, it really is. And most of the people I talk to, if they're not using it for fishing, the parachute anchors on the trawlers, they're using it because they ended up with a mechanical failure, which is a clogged fuel line is the most common use why they have to deploy their chutes. And here again, if you have to set up a bridle because your boat's tacking back and forth, you go midship cleat and tie off there. And that happens to be, we just use rolling hitches on that one and a loop knot to help create that bridle. So there's the pendant line that you've already seen. So we can use pendant lines or we can use dock lines. Now for multi-holes, I'm always going to use a bridle for deployment with a parachute sea anchor. And then the bridle itself is going to be, again, it's going to be 1 foot for every foot of boat. We can use either the fixed bridle, which you see pictured here, or we can use a pendant line set up to form the bridle. If you use a pendant line, that block is going to be really close to the boat. That's okay. It's not a bad thing, but that's the only way it's going to remain nice and taut. This system allows you to adjust the rode if you want, but it's something you might want to practice. A fixed setup, you've already got the predetermined length. So if it's a 40-foot multi-hull, you're going to have 400 feet of rode attached to that bridle, which is 40 feet in length. Just bear in mind, other manufacturers are going to say, 2.5 times, 3 times the width of your multi-hull is the length of your bridle. Some will even say up to, I think overseas, they said up to 120 feet. I have a problem with really long bridles just because they will go slack. There's no doubt in my mind that they have a tendency to go slack if you don't. Here's a picture of a longer bridle setup, and what will happen is one side will go slack and all the loading goes to one side, so your boat starts to spin out, starts to turn in the direction it's being pulled. At least that's what I've noticed over the years. Securing the bridle actually to the boat, normally I just go straight to mooring cleats. Some people have eye setups on the holes where you can shackle them to. So if you have something that you can shackle to the boat itself, that means the bridle will have a splice on both sides of the rode that allows you to shackle to the boat, and then also allows you to shackle to the main rode leading out to the parachute. Here on this multi-hull, we're using a crossbar attachment here. It wasn't actually designed for that, but we tried rigging a bridle from the mooring cleats and it was rubbing up against the cables there. So we had to kind of make do with what we have, and that was actually a good attachment point for us to use. When it comes to deployment, I usually just pick one side or the other of the multi-hull, and that's where I'll deploy the equipment from that. And it's going to be the same thing as the trawler and the model. Everything's the same when it comes to deployment. We're going to toss a float and so forth into the water. Trip line goes in the water first, right? We're maintaining control of the stainless hardware. And then a lot of times when I get to the bridle point, I'm making sure it's not catching on anything, though on a multi-hull, I've never had anything catch, and any bridle catch up on there. What's cool about the multi-hull, you got a lot of space to work from, so that makes life a little bit easier. There's the air pocket in the parachute, which is common. Now we're going to go into retrieval. If you have any questions on deployment, because I do run a little quickly on some of this stuff, you can go ahead and ask questions to Barb and she can let me know. For retrieval, you can see that big red float floating on the water. That's our marker. And remember, when we retrieve the equipment, we're doing the same thing that we do when we deploy the equipment. Everything's done on the windward side, because what if wind and wave is, there's going to be wind and wave action happening. So if we want our boat to be knocked away from everything, not into stuff that's underwater. So that float is our marker. And so in this case, in this picture, I'm looking at that float and using hand signals usually to direct where the equipment is in the water. I'm trying to loosen up the bridle first, because I don't want to have 2 rods to handle. I want to have a single rode to handle. So if you have a pendant line with a block, we're going to slacken that and remove that first. One thing to keep in mind, we were just doing practice, nice calm weather practice here, but notice the sailor's hands. That's a great way of getting your fingers pinched. So you always want to grab the neck of that splice, which means where those white floats are, you want to be holding on to that, because your fingers can't get caught into anything. And then of course, after we told her about that, she said, okay, on this next turn on this pendant line, I'm going to use a hook, which is fine. You can do that too. Try to avoid the pinch. And same with this partner of mine. His hand is going to end up by that thimble, and he's not going to keep his fingers on the other rode where the block can roll over them. It hurts. So as we're recovering the equipment, the person in charge of recovering equipment, just like in deploying the equipment, is going to be the person actually deploying the equipment, not the helms person. The helms person is going to follow directions by that person because they can't see as well up front what's going on in the water, or in back of them if they happen to be deploying, a storm drogue. So we're motoring towards the floats at the trip line, at the end of the trip line, and meanwhile we're hand over hand placing road on the deck and recovering. And if the helmsman's going too fast, signal them to go in reverse for a moment and slow down. So as soon as you get the trip line, you're going to pull that in hand over hand. And as soon as you do that, the chute will turn around and it will collapse like an umbrella. It closes rather quickly, and you can continue pulling it on board. If the chute happens to be really large, or you're seasick and not feeling well, you can actually walk backwards and use your body weight to help pull the chute on board. And the edge of the boat itself also kind of acts as an extra pair of hands as you're walking backwards if you get caught in that situation. In this picture, I've got stuff all over the place, but if you notice, the pairing hardware over here is by itself because I'm trying to maintain control of the hardware even when I'm retrieving, all of the equipment. And there'll might still be some road still in the water, so you want to pull that on deck. And the helms person's job is just to maintain position. Now that we've recovered everything, allow the person an opportunity to go ahead and pack all the parachute sea anchors. If you take off, it's going to be a rather bouncy trip. And I've been with some really good instructors in San Francisco outside the bay practicing stuff, and they started getting seasick. And if you're going to get seasick with me, I'm going to start to feel it too. So helms person, wait, please. Okay, so for packing the shoes, they're gonna, some companies you just have to roll them up like sleeping bags. There's nothing major that you have to do for packing, and there's videos on YouTube and stuff to show how to do all the packing for most companies anyway. And if you have a deployment type bag set up where you have to pack the parachute, you do have to pack the panels a little bit more carefully, similar to aerial parachutes, but not as hardcore to aerial parachutes. You're not going to die if you accidentally don't pack a parachute anchor perfectly, but just to be aware, you will have to pack those a little bit like that. So I want to go into parachute sea anchor sizing just a little bit. There's all kinds of size for different types of boats and different types of projects. For myself or the crew I've taught at Fiorentino, as I always say, they're normally never going to send a parachute anchor unless they actually talk to you or get an email or something, because they want to know what your intended use is. Intended use really factors into what size parachute sea anchor you need. If it's for safety, it's a little bit easier because we know there's a lot of wind blowing and things like that that will keep the parachute inflated a little bit easier. If it's for fishing purposes, the weather tends to be more calm when you're fishing. We're actually going to say, well, you need larger parachute anchor to actually hold your place, because the bigger the chute, the more water it creates, which will create extra tension in the road. And so if you have a full keel sailboat, it happens to be more stable than my fin keel Beneteau, for example, I can get away with using a smaller chute, likely just because the boat heaves too easily. If you're heaving too with a bridle and everything with a parachute up, you probably get away with a smaller chute. If you're going to go head to wind, likely maybe a slightly larger chute will be better. It depends on whether your boat's borderline sizing, and everybody's going to be completely different in their thinking on sizing. None of the manufacturers are really on the same page, and this year will kind of give you a rough idea. Like if you look at the trawler at the very bottom, you can see the different companies saying, oh no, here's a 16 foot, here's a 30 foot, here's a 24 foot, here's a 60 foot. And that just shows you that there is a wide variation. And I can tell you for sure, the 60-foot diameter chutes that Fiorentino make is well over 300 pounds. So I don't think a 40-foot trawler is going to really want to have that kind of setup. So we're now going to go into speed living drogues and the stopping drogues. Anything that you tow behind your boat is a drogue, whether it'll be a manufactured device or something that you want to build makeshift wise. If it's going to be a makeshift drogue, normally I will tow, whether it's 5/8 or 3/4 inch rode, both ends have a cut or a bitter end, right? You would tie those off on your port and starboard cleat, and in the middle of this giant U that you're dragging behind your boat, you're going to add probably around 20 pounds of weight. It doesn't have to be exact, but around that amount. It'd be chain wrapped up into a ball. It could be a small stern anchor, and maybe some boat fenders, but you might lose the boat fenders if you don't really secure them to that road. I like the fenders because I don't necessarily want everything to sink too much, especially when it comes time for recovery. That's just something to consider if you don't have any equipment on board. I've tried the makeshift stuff for parachute sea anchors with sails, but the only problem, they have a tendency to collapse a whole lot, and you'll either have to put a spar on them and lots of weight on the bottom. I've seen stuff from 1550. That's what they did. They had spars on top of the sails and these big weights at the bottom of them. That was the only way to really get a makeshift parachute anchor for, say, to actually function. So for the speed limiting drogues, actually, let me go back. Let me go forward here. There are all kinds of types of devices used for drogues when it comes to speed limiting. It's all kinds of shapes and sizes. They all work. It's just a matter of really taking a look at what all the manufacturers have to offer price-wise and things like that. This is the most common setup for towing a storm drogue for speed limiting purposes to slow you down. If you notice, the road is moved forward towards the companionway doorways, and those are snatch blocks. These pictures up here are supposed to be snatch blocks, bringing the road back to your primary winch. So most of the loading is on the snatch block itself. The more forward you have the force of the dynamic loading, the easier it is for your boat to turn. I personally don't like to have that much stuff on there, just because it just a little bit more work. I would prefer to run the roads directly to the primary winch. The boat, to me, still turns really well. This is a picture just of that, of the road just being led directly to the primary winch. And every boat I've been on so far, I've been able to turn the boat relatively easily. On the stern, if I have chocks, my boat has chocks on it, so I run the bridle normally through there. But if you only have cleats at the stern quarters, that road, the bridle is going to be bouncing all over the place. So you're going to have to use a stopper line or a snatch block or something to help keep it in place so it doesn't bounce around too much. There's my picture of my boat there. So we actually are towing a series drogue here, a stopping drogue. And so we ran it through the chocks. I've never had any problem with it of popping out or anything like that. In some circumstances, I used to have a Catalina 25 that would go gale force testing out by Catalina Island. And we needed the primary winches to actually sail the boat. So we cleated our bridle. I know this is not a bridle. I just want to demonstrate that's how you attach your drogue to the cleat. The bridle will be attached to the cleat, and it's a real the boat does not turn well at all. And if you have a tiller and you're sailing in 35, 40 knot winds, I tell you, it's a heck of a workout and more difficult than having the anchoring point more towards the companionway door. But sometimes you have to work with what you have. Road-wise, for Fiorentino anyway, I've always recommended for them to always go with 10 feet for every foot of boat. Though most of the time, if I'm traveling, I'm only going to use 300 feet of road. That's what I usually carry. But we recommend the same for the parachute anchor as we do for the storm drogue. There's a lot of crossovers that are the same. And part of that is so that you can interchangeably use equipment. Other suppliers are going to recommend, I have everybody's instructions, and most instructions are just 1 to 3 wavelengths. There's really no clear indication on how much road that's actually supposed to be. So regardless of whose product you may have or decide to acquire, 300 feet, you'll be fine. 5/8 inch diameter is the primary road I use. And remember, the nylon and Dacon ropes absorb water and they're heavier. That creates drag. So if you're using a Spectra or Dyneema, which is very easy to move around the boat, you're going to have to add 20 pounds of weight. At least that's my experience. Other companies may have other ideas on how to do that. Now, most of the drogues, half the companies recommend chain weight in front of the drogue. Others don't recommend any chain at all. If you have chain in front of the drogue, you can still bring it on board using your primary winch up until you reach the chain portion of it, and you'll have to pull the chain up and away from the boat when you're recovering the drogues. So when I designed the shark drogue, like the series drogue, they have a thimble at the very end of their drogue for adding weight. Having the weight behind the drogue is kind of nice, because then you can use your primary winch to haul in the drogue completely. When it comes to weight, one of the reasons I like to add weight to the drogues because they sink really quickly. So if you have a drogue with no weight, don't be surprised if it takes a little while for it to actually inflate and take hold. Trip lines, I work with a bunch of ladies that answer questions on the forums and things like that, and a lot of people have recommended using trip lines for drogues. What always ends up happening is I end up chasing the trip line, and by the time I get to the trip line, I could already have the drogue on board. So I tend not to use trip lines. Besides, what you're not seeing in this picture is that the drogue and rope and everything is sliding underneath the boat, which is why I don't bother with trip lines when it comes to drogues. With bridles, again, the manufacturers are all over the place on what kind of lengths to use. I prefer to use shorter bridles. I have a fin, so if you have a fin keeled boat, you're going to notice that the bridles, the shorter you keep them, the more taut it stays and the easier it will handle. And to answer that question earlier that I had, I always tend to rig bridles for the drogues, simply because if you have it just, if all the loading's on one side of the boat tends to be tugged in that direction. It wants to turn right, basically, if all the loading's on the starboard side. And so by spreading the load, it just makes it a little more simple for steering, as having the loading more forward towards the companionway, doorway, both make it a little bit easier for actually steering. And in bigger seas, that's going to make a big difference when you're talking about actively steering a boat. So back to the Beneteau, when I was sailing down to Mexico with my buddy, we were just practicing a little bit. It was only like 36 knot winds and I don't know, 10-foot seas or whatever. And you just found that with our boat wiggling all over the place, that 3 feet to 5 feet deployed from the transom that was the sweet spot for our particular boat. Full keel boats can probably go really long because they track so darn straight. They can get away with longer bridle setups. And like I said, everybody's going to be all over the board. Some people are going to say, 80 feet, 120 feet, whatnot. I bridle wise, I usually carry about 20 feet just in case I want to make an adjustment. If I'm going to save the bridle later on for emergency steering, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and then I might make the length a little bit longer, like 60 feet bridle wise. You can use a pendant line. I have a lot of people I spoke with, they want to use their pendant line for forming so they can heave to with their parachute sea anchor, and also use the same pendant line for their storm drogue. And that's fine. Just keep in mind that a pendant line, because it's a block, if you want it to stay nice and taut, it's going to be really close to the back of the boat. So if you've got a wind vane or something else in the way, that might be an issue if you use the block. Also, in this case, we actually had to use cleats to keep the bridle down so that it wouldn't rub up against the dinghy. So just give you some ideas. I've tried narrow bridles, because in the case of this Catalina, there's so much stuff. I'll show you a picture of all the stuff that's in the way, that I knew there was going to be some kind of rubbing or chafing on the bridle setup if this was in a storm. And so I tried the narrow bridle. It doesn't work at all. It sucks. So back to things getting in the way. So when you're setting up your bridle, in this boat, there were things that was going to rest up against, and there's really not a lot I could do as I'm passing the bridle. And like I said earlier, it's always a good idea if you think the weather's going to turn on you, have the bridle set, because you have to get around all kinds of stuff on the stern. Unlike the parachute anchor, usually it's pretty wide open for deployment, but there's a lot of equipment usually kept at the stern. So let's have the bridle moved, have that at least set up, and you can secure it in, inside the cockpit area. And here's showing you that same Catalina where, well, too bad, the bridle's going to rest against the cable. That's okay. It's not going to be a whole lot of loading on a speed limiting drogue anyway. Not a whole lot of loading with that. So for deployment, now you probably waited till it's too late. So you're hauling really quickly, very fast. Everything's going to be very fast with storm drogue deployment, a lot faster than with the parachute sea anchor, because you're kind of stopping the boat a little bit already if you have engine power when you're deploying it. But the drogues are going to be much quicker. So the first thing I always deploy will be the weight. You're going to hold the weight in one hand, whether it's chain balled up or if it's the mushroom anchor like in this picture here, and the rod next to the hardware when you're dropping that in the water. And as soon as it hits the water, that rod is going to go flying out, and the bag, the rod's already flaked back and forth, so that the rod will not catch on itself and create knots. And you'll see my buddy here, who I've been training with since the mid 90s on using this equipment, knows I better grab the neck of the rod. And I tell you, when he grabbed that bridle, and this is practice, just in practice, not really moving super fast, so you wouldn't storm. He's grabbing that bridle the moment he dropped the drogue in, and he's dropping everything in the water. That's how fast this equipment will deploy. And this just shows you what a fixed bridle looks like up close. Your two rods are shackled into a single rod leading out to the drogue. That's your fixed bridle. Okay. And you can, of course, this is pendant line. You can use that for the same purpose. And this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for that bridle to stay nice and taut. On our Beneteau, we were using 20 feet, not the 3 to 5 feet. That seems to work better on my boat, but we were using 20 feet. And then we started getting that slack that I was talking about. That means all the loading is now going to one side of the boat. And eventually when our boat position changes, the other road's going to get nice and taut. And that's when you get that shock loading. Remember, shock loading starts to reduce rod strength by about 40%. That wouldn't be the Spectra Dyneema, because they don't absorb, they absorb very little water, little to nothing. Now, the series drogue, when they had the Coast Guard test, they were initially saying 35 to 50 pounds to deploy for most boats. And I think that's still the best way to go. They've changed that. The suppliers have changed the recommendation several times for unknown reason, but 35 to 50 pounds will sink this very quickly. But even if I'm only adding 10 pounds to the back of the series drogue, just be aware that this stuff is going to fly out very quickly, just like the speed limiting drogues. And those cones do have a lot of bite on them, okay? They really do have a lot of drag. So just be aware of that. And in the bridle setup, I choose to do it the same way as I would a speed limiting drogue. I keep them short as I can. The suppliers of the series drogue have their own recommendations on bridles. They're going to be a little bit longer in reference to the bridle set. It's nothing wrong with it. It's just we all have our own methods of how we want to reduce slack rope. So when it comes time for recovering the storm drogues, it's going to be the same as the parachute sea anchor, right? If I have a pendant line or I have a fixed bridle setup, I want to slacken one of the rods on that bridle so that I can bring it to the other side of the boat. The side of the boat I intend to turn, which will end up being on the lee side of all the equipment. So you got to actually sometimes stop and go, okay, which side of it? Oh yeah, in this case, we're moving it over to the port side because we're going to turn in that direction, keeping the drag device and ropes and everything upwind from us, right? That way, if wind and wave hits the boat, we get knocked away from all the equipment. Okay, that's why we want to do it that way. A single rod is easier to handle than two rods in the water. It avoids making mistakes. And you can see we're starting to turn here, right? And you have the option of bringing in the drogue hand over hand. You can do that. That's how I like to do it. But you know, you can sometimes run into a few issues. It can pull out of your hand if the wave hits you strong enough. But you can also use your primary winch to haul in everything that way. It will take you longer because the wind's going to capture the boat and push it away from everything. It'll create some loading on there. It might take you longer, but you're not going to get anything tangled or nothing's going to pull out of your hands in that case. And like I said before, if you have chain on that drogue, that last part's going to suck, but you just have to pull it up and away from the boat. You're going to get a bit of a workout in that particular setup. And then whether it's a series drogue or the shark drogue, you'll be able to, the weight's behind it, so you can use a primary winch to haul in all that kind of stuff. Just be careful on the cones. If you have a series drogue, when it comes up to the primary winch, you can have it self-tailoring and all that, but you don't want to catch the cones too much on the winch because it will tear them. So you're trying to avoid. You want to reuse the equipment later on, of course, which is why you want to be careful. And then, oh yeah, this is a great reminder for me that when I don't worry about flaking everything perfectly in the bag. So on the series drogue, because I don't want to end up with a major tangle, I will just I'll just keep putting everything in a circular pattern and stack it on top of itself, and then get back to flaking it in the bag properly later on down the road. Now, for emergency steering, normally we're just going to connect the drogue to the bridle. It doesn't matter what the drogue is. The Gale Rider, which you see pictured here, the web drogue, requires chain for its emergency steering. So really the setup is going to be extremely similar to the speed limiting drogue. The more I have loading on up forward by the companionway doorway, the easier it is to turn the boat. Okay. This was just sent by Cruising Compass this morning. George Day is great. He always sends good articles and so forth on here. But this is a picture of what you don't want to have happening. If you notice the bridle here, it's the one on the starboard side is completely underwater. Okay. In this case, they don't have a rudder, but if your rudder's jammed over, your cables are broken, there's that gap between the rudder and the hull. And if your bridle's sliding under the water, it's going to get caught up in that gap. And the reason I know is because I've done this before during a training, and it's a real pain to get it out when you're underway. And even if you do lose the rudder, you got to remember you're in sloppy ways. That boat's being knocked around. That's going to knock the bridle into the prop, and you're going to have it. Even if you don't have it engaged, it's going to wrap around that prop. If you have your engine engaged, you're really going to have a tangled mess. So they did everything correct in this video. Did a great job with the video. The only mistake is here at the transit where the port and starboard quarters are. They could have used blocks to help keep the bridle up. Part of the problem is with the Gale Rider, you need all this chain, which causes it to sink, and the Gale Rider has really long shroud lines, rope, like the parachutes, and that keeps the drogue further away. So you need longer ropes to make it go to port and starboard for turning the boat itself. Most makeshift drogues or actual drogues to be connected directly to the bridle gets it closer to the boat, and that's really what I'd like to do. If you've seen other articles in the past, the reason you'll see spars on the back of the transit with blocks at the end of them is that is where they're actually anchoring and putting all the loading. As I told you before, if you have loading on the stern at the transom, it's really difficult to steer the boat. So if you have it really wide on these blocks and spars, well, then the boat's going to turn around a little bit easier. But they put the spars up there because they're trying to keep the bridle, trying to avoid having the bridle sink into the boat. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but this is really important because we don't want to have anything tangling. You can use car tires, you can use a manufactured drogue for emergency steering as well. But what I have found, instead of going with a snatch block, which is an extra step, I like to run the bridle directly to the primary winches. Okay, that way the boat still turns just as simple as ever. And it's just one less step to have to mess with. So that's why I like to do that. And the biggest complaint I've ever had in the drogues that Fiorentino has supplied to people was holding them too much in lighter wind conditions for people that actually had to use the drogue for emergency steering. Well, I try to remind them, and this would work for other drogues as well. Bring it close to the boat so it starts to surface. That'll dump out half the water, and that'll make it a lot easier for turning the boat. And it's probably no big mystery to you that, hey, if I pull the drogue to the starboard side, the boat turns right. If I pull it to port, it turns left, right? Really kind of simple. I think what you'll find, though, in most emergency steering situations is a lot of times you're going to have a rudder jammed over or just kind of flopping around because the cables are broken. So you frequently might have a drogue set to one side like this, and you now have set course, you're just going to keep sailing one direction. So you may not be tacking very frequently with emergency steering device. Just something, food for thought. And like I said, I like to run the bridle because we're not using any other rods. We're just using a bridle straight to the drogue. I try not to use chain weight if I can when it comes to the drogues for emergency steering. And I will let rods sit on the cleat. As long as it's not bouncing around, I don't have to use a stopper line. So if this was bouncing around too much and I didn't want to use a snatch block, I just get a spare line and tie it off on just from this picture on the stanchion and maybe another cleat or a tow rail just to keep the rod in place so it doesn't bounce around too much. And they have those cool, I can't think of the name of them. They have those little plastic eyes on that Spectra rope you could tie off on the cleat. You can run rod through that too. There's another way of preventing it from bouncing all over the place. They got all kinds of cool stuff. And then when it comes to emergency steering, I have used sheet blocks. I don't like to because that's where you're going to have your those are where your lines run through for your sheets run through for sailing, and I don't like to put a lot of loading on that. But when we're doing our little practice run here for the Transpac, man, does it really turn the boat really easily. So that is a good setup. Okay, fun question. This is a merchant ship. This picture is actually from the 1800s. I actually have the specs on how to build parachute sea anchors from that time period. And I had a naval engineer look at the specs and tell me, I said, what modern size parachute anchor would work for this 200-ton merchant ship? So you have 5 seconds to guess. And the answer is a 16-foot diameter parachute sea anchor. And you're probably thinking, or hopefully thinking, that small a parachute for this giant ship. And I think it's because of the hull. It's really heavy, and you're talking about all kinds of sail mounts. In fact, in this illustration, they're using a riding sail on the back, so that's partly why they could probably get away with that kind of size. And I think that's it for me. Is that for my little? Oh yeah. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. I know I went fast through some of the stuff. Are you there, Barb?
Yep, I'm here, Zach.
I'm just
Thank
making
you so
sure.
much. Yeah, great presentation. Questions, anyone? Write them right in the chat box. A lot of good information for sure, Zach. Thank you.
Here, I'll do another fun thing for you. Oh, if I can even pick this up. If there's any questions or not, that's fine. We'll have a show and tell. So in your mind, you don't have to do this in the chat. What size parachute anchor does this go to? You got to think of what size parachute is this massive piece of stainless going to go to? Oh God, I got to put it down. Sorry, bang, slam, crash. That Fiorentino uses that for chutes sizes in range from 50 to 70 feet. So they do make these massive giant parachute anchors that, believe it or not, I work with a sole operator who's hugely strong, and her and I can actually pack that several 100-pound chute in one bag. So 2 of us can do it. So when I was sending to the Coast Guard, they asked me for like a photographic instruction thing. So I sent them the photograph instruction, and I said, 4 of your crew member better be able to deploy this without any problems, because me and 1 woman packed this chute. So that was my motivation to make sure that those guys will. I'm sure they'll do the job well. I just wanted to put a little fire under the butt for fun.
Zach, we do have a question here. How long should the trip line be?
50 feet to 100 feet. And the reason we go with shorter trip lines, especially for storm use, is it's easier to handle the rope for one. And also it avoids tangles, because a lot of, if you read some of the Linen Party storm tactic books and some of the original first editions, Fiorentino was the only one listed because he was the only one selling the parachute anchor, but he taught them and everyone else, including myself, to use a full trip line that's tied back to the boat. So if you have, say, 300 feet of nylon road, you're going to have something like 340 feet of trip line that you have to handle, which is a lot of work. And that stuff always, in the parties even talked about, wraps around your chute. That was what the commercial fishermen use, because they're in the middle of fishing when they have the chutes and they have to go ahead and recover those right away. Same with the sport fishermen. So we use 50 to 100 feet because it's just easier to handle. You don't really need a lot more. Now, some single-handed sailors will have longer trip lines, but I still tell them just tie it up on the float, because the wind will blow everything away from them. That just means they hopefully have a little shorter distance to get to the trip line to recover the chutes. It's a little tougher for single handers. No trip lines for the drogues. So easy. These are easy questions. No one's going to try to trip me up or something.
Any other questions? Type them in now. I think you've covered things so well.
Oh, this happens all the time. Sometimes I get questions, sometimes I don't. And if I get questions, it's normally because I move too fast on a particular subject. Well, it's fun. I wish I could see you all, because I've been locked in COVID for with everyone else. Always, I want to see people. I don't feel like I've gotten out yet.
Yeah, Zach said that this was his first Zoom presentation, so I think he did a great job. I have a few people typing in, Zach, the same thing. Thanks for your presentation. Well done. Yeah. So much info so quickly, I need to study the recording. Someone else typed in.
But Salty Dog has an article I wrote for you guys in 2017. Usually the link was working. It wasn't working today, but that actually goes over everything much quicker. What's so sweet, it was so nice is, the Salty Dog wanted it so short. It forced me to put everything, cram everything together. So if you guys can find that as a link, I mean, it's in your Salty Dog 2017, number 55 or something. I can't remember. I don't remember. I had it written down somewhere, but it was like number 50 or no, 15, number 15 issue.
I'll make sure that link is working. And like I said, we'll send out the recording to everyone. So
okay.
If you were here today, you'll be able to review it. So yeah, a lot of great information. Thank you so much, Zach.
Great. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you, Zach.
Okay.